There is a hallway in a museum where faces from different centuries stand side by side in silence. Some are carved from marble, others from granite or bronze. Some come from ancient Greece, others from Egypt, Rome, or distant parts of Asia. They were created by different civilizations, separated by geography, language, and time. And yet, when viewed together, something begins to feel strangely familiar. The expressions rarely change. The eyes are calm and distant. The mouths remain neutral, almost suspended between emotion and emptiness. The symmetry is precise, not perfectly identical, but consistent enough to create a quiet sense of repetition. At first, this seems expected. Ancient sculpture often followed artistic conventions. Certain facial proportions were considered ideal. Symmetry represented balance, harmony, divinity. Expressions were restrained because statues were not intended to capture fleeting emotion, but permanence. This is the official understanding, and it explains much of what we see. But as the comparisons continue, another question slowly emerges. Why do cultures that developed independently keep returning to faces that look so similar? Because the similarities are not limited to broad artistic choices. They extend into details. The shape of the eyes, the smoothness of the forehead, the calm, detached expression, the way the face appears less like an individual person and more like a template, image refined and repeated across generations. This can be explained through practical technique. Stone carving naturally favors symmetry and simplified forms. Artists learned from earlier works, preserving proportions that had already been established. Over time, certain styles became associated with beauty, wisdom, or authority. Again, these are reasonable explanations, but they become more complex when the pattern appears across cultures with limited direct contact. Ancient Egyptian statues often display the same still gaze found in Greek sculpture centuries later. Buddhist statues in Asia carry a similar emotional restraint. Roman busts, despite their greater realism, frequently return to the same balanced facial structure, not identical, but connected, as though each culture inherited fragments of the same visual language. There are also the eyes. In many statues, the eyes are unusually emphasized in it through dramatic detail, but through shape and focus. They appear alert, yet detached, present, but emotionally distant. The effect is subtle, but when repeated across hundreds of sculptures, it begins to create an unusual impression, not of individuality, but of continuity, as if the statues are not portraits of different people, but variations of the same underlying image. The official explanation points toward symbolism. Statues often represented ideals rather than individuals. Gods, rulers, philosophers, and spiritual figures were depicted according to established visual standards. The goal was not realism in the modern sense, but permanence. Emotion changes, ideals remain. This perspective is supported by historical records, and yet it leaves room for another layer of interpretation, because even idealized images originate somewhere. At some point, someone defines what the ideal looks like, and once defined, that image begins to repeat, not only through art, but through culture itself. There is also the matter of preservation. Many statues that survive today were not ordinary objects. They were important enough to protect, display, or bury carefully. What remains visible to us may represent only a narrow category of artistic work, the formal, ceremonial, or sacred. This creates a kind of distortion. We are not seeing the full range of faces that existed. We are seeing the faces that civilizations chose to preserve, and the faces they preserved seem remarkably consistent. Calm, balanced, detached from ordinary emotion. There are practical reasons for this as well. Strong emotional expressions are difficult to carve convincingly in stone. Neutral faces age better visually and structurally. Simpler forms survive erosion more effectively. These factors shape artistic choices, but they do not entirely explain the psychological effect these statues create when viewed collectively, because beyond technique and symbolism, there is something else happening. Recognition, not conscious recognition, but a subtle familiarity. People often describe ancient statues as feeling strangely alive, even when their features are minimal. A face carved thousands of years ago can still appear recognizable as a specific person, but as something deeply familiar. This may simply reflect shared human perception. We are drawn to symmetry. We search for faces and patterns. We respond instinctively to eye contact, even when the eyes are carved from stone. But the consistency remains notable, especially across time, because civilizations change dramatically. Languages disappeared, religions transformed, empires collapsed, and yet the faces remained almost unchanged. Not perfectly identical, but stable. A visual idea carried forward through centuries. There is also the question of influence. Artistic styles spread through trade, conquest, migration, and imitation. Greek sculpture influenced Roman work. Egyptian aesthetics shaped neighboring regions. Cultural exchange explains many similarities, but influence alone does not fully account for the emotional consistency, the stillness, the restraint, the strange absence of individuality. Even when artists became capable of realism, many continued returning to the same calm expression, as though realism itself was not the point. Perhaps the statues were never meant to capture ordinary humans at all, not literally, but symbolically. Perhaps they represented permanence rather than personality, stability rather than emotion, a version of humanity refined into something times, and if that is true, then the repeated faces may reflect less about the people being depicted, and more about the ideals civilizations wanted to preserve. But even this interpretation leaves an unanswered feeling, because when standing among these statues, there is often a sense that the faces are observing rather than being observed, not through expression, but through stillness, a stillness repeated so consistently that it begins to feel intentional in a deeper way, not unsettling in an obvious sense, just slightly outside normal human interaction, as if emotion has been reduced to its minimum form, enough to feel human, not enough to feel personal, and perhaps that is why the pattern stands out. Not because the statues are mysterious individually, but because together they create continuity across civilizations that were otherwise very different. A continuity of face, of expression, of proportion, as though, beneath changing cultures and eras, the same image continued to return, quietly, repeatedly, preserved in stone. This does not suggest a hidden origin or forgotten civilization. It may simply reflect the ways humans define beauty, balance, and permanence. But it is worth examining why those definitions remained so stable for so long, why so many cultures arrived at nearly the same emotional silence, and why the faces carved thousands of years ago still feel recognizable today. Because perhaps the strangest thing about ancient statues is not that they resemble each other, but that, despite the distance of history, they still resemble us, just enough to feel familiar, and just distant enough to feel unresolved.